Okay, well, I think I'm here now. What's up, guys?
Hey,
Well,
looking
welcome.
good, George. How you doing?
Oh, it's still early.
So, George, I have to tell you a quick story. So, when I was about 13, I went to Manny's looking at instruments to buy. Then I started walking down 42nd towards 42nd Street, and there was this little record store, and they always had great stuff. I got the meters on Josie Records for 69 cents. I went home
Wow.
and paid the shit out of that record.
Yes, indeed.
You get royalties from that, George, from his 69 cents.
No, I kind of think that record label kept all the money.
Yeah, as most did.
What a surprise. So, George, what have you been doing during this lockdown? Anything musical?
Well, actually, during the lockdown, we myself and the band Running Partners.
Yeah.
I kind of put most of the blame on my keyboard, Michael Limler. He is such a techno person. He has his pulse, his finger on the pulse of reading manuals and making stuff work. But we bought this when we both use, all of us actually, we use Pro Tools.
Okay.
And we about 6-7 years ago we invested into this cloud, when we upgraded to Pro Tools 10, I believe, or something like that.
Right.
The cloud thing came available to us. But we never used it. We never used it because it was so easy for everybody to come over to my house and we just work here in the studio.
Right.
And so COVID thing come up, and we I called Mike. I said, man, you think this might be a good time to find out what this cloud thing does? Because I think it's a great time for us to try and work on a record, And he said, I agree. Let me do some homework and I'll call you tomorrow. So basically he called me the next day and he told me, he showed me how to upload the songs that was there already, that was prepared.
Okay.
With the old guitar player and Brent Anderson, who left the band, and we have now, that's what made me start my trio band, because Brent left the band. And I just said, man, I'm just gonna play as a trio with Mike and Terrence and myself. And then we, the booking agency called me up and said, man, people are asking for Running Partners dates. He said, you guys need to, put together a band, So at that point, we looked into a young man named Chris Atkins, and invited him, to come in. And he's been wonderful energy, and he's young. He does homework, which is like in our day and age, young musicians who do homework. That's like remarkable. And he came ready, man. He came ready. And he learned songs that we have forgotten. He like pretty much he learned the whole Running Partners catalog and came ready to play it. It was killing. So I said, well, let's take and replace Brent's guitar parts with Chris. And while we were doing that, I started writing some new songs. So we used like maybe 5 to 6 songs from the original session that Chris just overdubbed guitar on. And I was in the process of listening to songs. I started writing new stuff, and so we wrote 6 more new pieces of material. So all total, we wrote 14 songs, but we put 12 together and finished 12 of them. So, I have a record that's, basically, I think they dropped the second single last week.
Okay.
The first one was dropped on my birthday, December 26th, was called "Crying for Hope."
Okay.
And then the newest one that they just dropped was "Get Back Up," which is an instrumental. The first one was a vocal song, and the second was an instrumental.
Well, we'll make certain to play that on the show.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think actually wasn't your last full record "Can't Beat the Funk," right?
The last full record was, yes, "Can't Beat the Funk." It was 12 or 14 songs, meter recordings that was never released by the Meters.
Right. Yeah, terrific.
Well, not never released. I'm sorry, it was never performed live.
Right. Right.
We recorded these songs, but we never played them as a band, you know. Yeah, and you know, people have been, you know, on my gigs, you know, people be walking up to me asking me to play songs, you know, and you know, and I say, well, man, I don't know about that one. You know, we haven't touched on that. So, you know, like in a lame, you know, I had maybe a month off or something like that, and I call the guys up and say, man, why don't we cut these songs, you know, and I gave them 24 meter tracks that the band never played, and you know, and the band came back to me and said, well, let's do these 12, you know, or just do these 14, and we recorded 14 tracks. We gave away 2 on my website. Those 2 are still up there for grabs, and then you know, the other 12 went to a CD.
Okay, yeah, okay, great record. Well, you know, while we're on the topic of recording and records, you know, you come, and David and I always address this topic. We tend to do it at the end of the show, but since you brought up Pro Tools, such a different world it is from recording analog to Pro Tools. Now, obviously, you came of age. Your greatest work was in the analog era when that red light went on and you guys had to deliver. Do you think how do you think Pro Tools and digital recording has affected the art form of recording and playing bass?
Well, you know, I think what the digital age has done, and I'm probably guilty of it, is not as allowed us not to be perfect from start. You know, it allows us to play multiple ideas and figure out which one really works.
Right.
You know, and for me, especially those songs that I'm singing, I tend to write these songs with just the bass, and write a bass line and something like that, and then that'll be the bed for the song. Right. But then when I get the lyrics back from my lyricist, you know, and I start trying to sing the stuff, and I sing it, then I realize that, man, wait a minute, I can't play that bass line and sing this melody, you know. So then one of them has to change, which in my world, I think it's easier for me to change a bass line, make a bass line a little simpler. Because I think as I've grown, I think I may have gotten a little busier again with bass lines, and so the vocal melodies, you know, bass line is getting in the way, so I need to simplify my bass line, so I can do them both. You know, it's been big, but that's what the digital world is allowed to. You know, back in the analog days, we'd have been in the studio and somebody had been real upset with me because I was, you know, taking too many takes. You know, take 33.
Well, you also wear out tape.
Y'all run out of tape.
But also you have to, I guess in your situation now, we are in the 21st century and I see all the equipment behind you. The nice thing is that you can make a great record in your living room now. So, I mean, there is a balance, there is a payoff in that sense. You don't have to spend the money on a studio because folks don't buy records anymore. It's all streaming now.
It's all streaming. And for me I'm thinking about buying my daughter's house next door and move the studio to the first floor. Right now, the first floor is on the studio is on the 3rd floor, so that means I got to climb 3 flights of stairs to get to it.
Cheaper to get an elevator put in.
Oh no! Then I have to buy the house by my neighbor because the elevator would have to fit on her side of the building. So yeah, I'm gonna have to buy somebody's house. But yeah, I'm liking the digital age, better than I because of like I said, it gives me the opportunity to play around with different ideas. I mean, there's one song that's on a new coming record. We called it Spanish Moss, and it was the whole song was I wrote the whole piece of music was written probably like the first I think it's probably like first 2.5 minutes of the song was all a bass line, almost like a bass solo for the most part. And when I was, once I uploaded it to the cloud, I contacted Chris, the guitarist, first, and I told him, I said, Chris, you think you can, the lines that I'm playing in section A and the B section, you think that you can play those in double stops, you know? And he said, oh yeah, man, give me a few, you know? And he popped out and jumped back at me about an hour later or something and said, check this out and see if you like it. And he did, but what he did do is that he played single notes and then he doubled, you know, he played the harmony thing. Yeah. And and so I told him, I said, no, Chris, I recognize that you're playing two parts. So I want to hear you do that together, because there's a certain you know, like a harmonic that you hear.
The resonance, the overtone.
Yeah. And he said, okay, I won't cheat. You know, he went back and he did it, and it did. And then when he came back the next time, he told me, say, you know, man, I see what you're saying, how different that sound, you know, because you played both of those notes at the same time. And so I wanted to take my part away and just have Chris's part be the lead. And I was going to put a bass line down. It was going to be much simpler. Boom, 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 boom. That was going to be my bass line for the song. And when Mike heard it, and Mike heard it, and him and Chris got their heads together, and they decided that I should leave my bass line, the original bass line, in with Chris. And so, like, the two of us are playing this part. And Michael Limler, the keyboardist, is going to now play a synth bass. To play the synth bass. Well, I mean, on the recording, it's me playing bass, but on the live gig, when we play it live, Mike is going to play the bass line in his left hand.
Yeah. Okay. Well, be careful, David. If you do sessions for George, no cheating.
Well, that's it. Well, you know, that's why I play 6-string bass, so I can do it all.
You're right.
But George, you know, one of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is as good a time as any, is that you really have embraced 21st century technology. You know, so I started looking at, you know, you use pedals, you know, using envelope filter, an octave bass, and chorus. When did you start using that, and what got you involved in hearing that?
Well, I believe that it was probably still in the 19th century when I started using pedals.
Okay.
I started using I used the wah-wah pedal in late 60s, late 60, 68, 69. Maybe I believe the album Chicken Strut.
That was a new device back then, yeah.
Back then, yeah, I used the wah-wah pedal on my bass, but I just used it. I used it on. I didn't play to get the waveform. I just used it for a tone.
Gotcha.
And when Leo introduced I think it was called a MXR pedal, the little orange.
Yep.
Phase shift, I believe they were called.
Phase 90.
Phase 90s, okay. Well, that Phase 90s was in the more in the 70s, I believe. This thing was a little scroll box about that big, and it was just, I think it was just called maybe a phaser or something like that. But it was orange. And it had one pedal, one button on it, and I think there's 2 knobs on it. I used to have one of those around the house. I kind of tried keeping all those old pedals. But I started using that stuff way back then, and when we recorded, let's see, I want to say in the not the Cabbage Alley album. In the Cabbage Alley album, I used a chorus pedal, not a chorus pedal, but that phase shifter thing.
Gotcha.
By the time we got to New Directions, I had went back. Whoa, you know what it was? You remember the Mutrons?
I was just going to ask you about that.
I had a Mutron. I had the Mutron 2. When I got sick of the wah-wah pedal, because I wasn't using the wah-wah as a wah-wah, I was using it just for a tone. And
Gotcha.
I found this somebody, I don't remember who, some bass player gave me the Octava pedal.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Sure.
And so I've been with some Maestro. I think it was made by Maestro, I believe.
Okay.
And I went looking up the Maestro thing, and saw this envelope filter, and I said, oh, maybe that's what I'm looking for. And I went got me one of them and hooked that sucker up. And man, I was in heaven. I mean, Name Up in Lights is on the New Directions record, is that envelope filter.
Yep. Yep.
And probably on a couple of Jungle Man. I believe it was there. Although by the time when we got into multi-track and when I was cutting two bass lines, I never had any input on what made it to the record. I would put my parts down,
Right.
and then I would go off to get high. And
somebody you could do that in those days, yeah.
And somebody else, actually, mixed in what they wanted to hear out of the bass. So a lot of times my effects channel didn't get used. It's just a clean bass.
Gotcha. Well, Mutron went out of business. Now they're back in business. They got the Mutron 3, and Neil Jason was playing that funk machine back in, I guess it was the 70s. We were all using that in the studio, and he has now reconstituted. It's a company called Sea Moon, and it's the exact replica of the original funk machine.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, yeah, they had a great sound too.
Yeah, I never got a funk machine. I used that Mutron all the way up until I had gotten these new custom double 15 boxes, the tuck and roll boxes,
Okay.
And I had gotten with the 200 custom 200 head, and I had a head on each cabinet. So when I bought the cabinet, it was like a head of the 200 head with two bottoms, with 415s, and I wanted to have a head on each cabinet. So I bought a second head, and I had this Mutron set up to go through these cabinets, and at a sound check, I hit that Mutron and took out all four speakers. All four speakers died right there. Bloop. No, I ended up playing the gig to a guitar.
Oh, good God. Without a Mutron.
Without a Mutron, yeah. And that was the last time I used that Mutron, because
I can't understand why. Wow.
That was it.
It's interesting. We talk about your tremendous body of work and all the geographic areas where we associate music. Now you had the sound of Muscle Shoals, you had Motown, you had the sound of Philadelphia, you had the Wrecking Crew in LA, and of course you had the New York contingency. I don't know if we had a name, and then of course there's the sound of Oakland with Tower of Power. What is it that gives New Orleans its unique sound? Is it part of the heritage? Is it the French, Spanish, Filipino, Native American heritage? What is unique to New Orleans where you have that sound, where you can recognize something from New Orleans in one note, one phrase?
I tried to think about what made that stuff happen that way. I think it had a lot to do with, because very, very, very few times when you're a session player, you actually have, the call of what your instrument's really going to sound like in this project, because, you play your part, they give you your check and you go away. And so that record comes out. So it's in the hands of, the producers and back in there, there's producers weren't as smart as they, as everybody thought producers was. Producers depended mostly directly on the engineer. The engineer was the guy. He was the solid ear of what making things sonically correct. And so I think that what it was back then, New Orleans had a great, Cosmo Matassa might have had a lot of influence on the sound
Mhm.
of New Orleans records, what they should sound like. And all the engineers that came behind him, were kind of encouraged to listen at this. That's what I
Okay.
want this music to sound like. No matter how way in the front you are, listen to this. And I mean, when the Meters moved from New Orleans to Atlanta to do the Strutting record and the Look Up Pie Pie record and the Strutting record,
Right.
we brought Skip Godwin to Atlanta with us. He was using these high-tech, multi-track desk. I can't remember the name of the desk, but it was like one of those desks.
Right.
And but when I listen to those records versus when I listen to the Meters record, that very first album, you can sonically almost hear the same thing. So the only thing mean that the engineer, you know what I'm saying? He mixed it like this. He used the same compression that was available to him, to get, the sounds that, that will, people always ask me about how I captured that low end thing, but I would love to take the credit for that, but I think that was all the engineer, because when I'm cutting the track, I mean, my bottom end is nice and fat, but that mid highs is a part of what I hear. I want to hear, because I guess it's the guitar player in me want to hear that mid top,
Right.
part. I want to hear those notes. I don't just want that D and G string to disappear in low end world, and I want some clarity. But those are original recordings, that D and G string kind of was like inside that. It would get lost especially if Art left hand got in the way.
Right.
And we just accidentally on the same note at the same time. My bass would disappear because Art's left hand. It was that B3 would just boom, just wipe it out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you started off as a classical guitar player. That's one of the two things you and I have in common. And actually, the classical guitar, the actual technique is very similar to the electric bass, because you're holding it. You're holding the classical guitar is held like an electric bass, with the hand positioning. So did that have? Was that an easy transition for you to make from the classical guitar to the electric bass?
It was very easy. It was very easy. My classical training, although it was very limited, it only was for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't about the classical music. It was more about the performance, being the ability to perform. The use of 9 of the 10 fingers.
Right.
And I. That was it was real easy for me to move from guitar to bass, real easy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, of course, obviously studying classical, you learn to read at least. And I know in classical, there's no E7 vamps or 12-bar blues.
Right.
You got to read what's on the page. Yeah.
Right. And that was and that's the thing today I miss more than anything is my abilities to read, to take and pull up a piece of music that I've never seen before and read it, because when we started working with Alan, he kind of like stifled the idea of reading, which we were in the studio lots and lots and lots, but I wasn't reading well in the studio. He was giving me parts to play.
Okay.
And I would play those parts, and when it were difficult parts and parts that I had to remember a lot of parts, I would always tell him, I said, man, it'd be much easier if I could read this stuff, and he'd say, if I wanted somebody to read this music, I'd have kept Walter Payton, who's the best reading bass player in the city. It wasn't about my abilities to read, it was the feel that I had in a relationship to Zigaboo on drums.
Right.
And that's what he was wanting. That's what he wanted in the music. He wanted that camaraderie between Zig and myself. although I was playing, most of the times my bass lines are in his left hands on almost all that stuff that we did with Lee Dorsey, Patti LaBelle, some of that stuff. Except for the Robert Palmer stuff. The Robert Palmer record was probably all my bass mind. You know, my thoughts, my bass thoughts.
Tremendous record. Yeah, well, when you look at Alan's work, I mean, like you mentioned, Patti LaBelle, Robert Palmer, of course, you know, Boz Scaggs, of course, and Lowell George and all that. Those are really feel records, although they're very concise. My educated guess was like, oh, these guys are reading charts, but yet again, it still has that loose feel that the meters have.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if Alan ever got. Well, I think I'm going to take that back because I think I'm lying, because I believe that he did eventually go back to putting music in front of people.
Okay.
You know, because you know, by the time guys like Chris Severin and those guys got into the studio with Alan, you know, he was at that age now that you know, it's much easier for me to write this out and read it, because those guys were excellent readers. You know, and you know, so if a fly flew on the paper, it got read.
Yeah. Well, George, I had another question. You know, that first Meters record, To a Boy Growing Up on 68th and Broadway in New York City, really changed my mind on a lot of things. And we had, well, you remember Stuff, of course, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that band. Yeah.
Gordon Edwards.
So I think my appreciation for Stuff, which is huge, would not have come about without listening to that first Meters record, because even though they're different, they're the same. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Oh, you know, our very first trip to LA, and I can't remember what year that was. It might have been, I don't know, what year did that very first Stuff album come out? 75
or 75?
74, yeah.
Yeah, around that.
Then you know, then we played a club out there. It was off the beaten path, and Stuff opened for us, and it was, you know, it was like their record release party.
Okay.
And they played that album, you know, in its entirety, you know, in their set before we came on. And I went back, you know, I sit there and listen to the whole record, and I went back to the band and said, what the fuck we gonna do now? You know, I mean, these guys just played all the music on the planet.
Listen, there were times I would listen to Richard T. playing piano, and I'd say, I'm not playing bass anymore.
That was a serious band. I loved that band. And that night I bought a cassette, because they had cassettes of it. They didn't have the labels made yet. It was just a cassette. And I remember buying the cassette, and I recently looked for it. I can't find it. So, but I got about 4,000 cassettes. So I'm still working my way to it. I'll find it again. But I love that record, man.
Wow. I wonder if Gordon Edwards is a disciple of George Porter, because I hear a lot of similarity. I mean, your style of bass playing, to my ears, it's a very staccato style. It's a style that leaves a lot of space. I think of like Doug Dunn, who, those of you guys are very different. When you look at a Doug Dunn chart, you see a lot of white space on the page, because Duck would love to groove with quarter notes, whole notes, you know, 8 notes. And I see that a lot in your playing, where you do leave a lot of space, and the bass tone, which was your P bass, I guess, just had that beautiful growl and resonance.
Yeah, everything after Cabbage Alley was that P bass.
Okay.
The bass that was on the Cabbage Alley record and the Strutting record, and almost most of the Liquor Pie Pie record was this old. I'll pull it on to show it to you. It's so telly. It's so telly.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Yeah, man. It's an old Animal.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Man,
wow.
I love this bass.
Unfortunately, our radio show, no one will be able to see
Oh,
that.
no, wait, this will be on. No, not really. This will be on Know Your Bass Player video. So yeah, all this is going to be
That's
seen.
right. That's right.
Oh, cool.
And George is wearing a good shirt to be on the.
Yeah, that I love that bass, and
Yeah.
And right now, the electronics may need to be, but I don't know who to send it to. I just don't trust it out of my hands, to give it to anyone.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, guys want to do fret jobs and stuff like that. That bass don't need a fret job. The neck is straight as hell. It's like a beautiful instrument. But yeah, so that bass went on everywhere from, I think the second album was Look a Pie Pie,
Right.
and the third album was Strutting, and then the first record that was considered a vocal record
Right.
was the Cabbage Alley record, and that bass did Cabbage Alley record as well.
Great.
Wow. And of course, nowadays you're using a Lakeland split coil like a P bass, yes?
I'm using a Lakeland. I'm using a D Lakeland. That's my favorite animal right now. It's Dan's new line that he's creating. Yeah, I have been doing Lakeland since I did that Government Mule tour. The young bass player named Greg Barzab was a Lakeland endorser, and I had a bass out there on the road with me. I had my P bass, then I was breaking strings on that thing like crazy, and my backup bass was a Warmit neck and a Warmit body, no name. And Greg called Dan up and told him, said, "Man, George Porter's out here on this tour, man, with a bass that don't have a name on it, man. That's like crazy, man. We got to do something about that." So Dan came to the show that we did in Chicago and bought a whole list, a whole bunch, about 5 or 6 basses out, and he pulled out what it is that what is his name? I always say it damn wrong, man. But it was now I can't even think of his name. But it was a P bass. It was made in China.
Okay.
It looked identical to what my P bass looked like when it was brand new, except that it had the fretless, because my P bass had a fretless neck on it before I put that there. Oh, my P bass is a Frankenstein. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it had that fretless neck on it. So I took that neck off because I went on tour with the Funky Meters, not the Funky Meters, but the Meters went out, and we were out for like 6 weeks or something like that with that fretless bass, and all I would do. and both Art and Zig, man, said, Art said he was gonna kill me. Zig just looked at me like, really, he just looked at me, man. What are you doing, man? And I was just sliding up and down that neck.
Sure, there's no speed bumps there. Yeah.
So when I got home off that trip, I went. A friend of mine had a music store, and I bought that neck from a guy who wife retired him from the business, and he sold that bass, the neck off the body, and
so that wife retired him.
Oh yeah, she said, "I'm gonna cut one or the other, either you or the bass."
Well, that's like that story. There's a cartoon that goes, there's a guy, a priest, with a wife. Obviously, the bass player has died, and then someone's in the background going, "God, I hope she doesn't sell them for what he told her he paid for them."
Yeah, I was looking at last night. I was looking. Well, I had did my little stream last night, and I played a few songs on the telly, and there was a guy on the stream that Dave Perrotto was his name, and he said he's a guitar player, songwriter, and he said, "Man, that bass, I love that bass." And he was in the store when the Fender rep was in the rock and roll music store, and I took the bass in to have it stripped down to this natural wood, because I had saw a bass that was stripped down to natural wood, no pick guard on it. It was beautiful. I thought it was beautiful. And I just said, man, I bet you this bass would look great stripped down. And that's what I wanted to go do with it. And then the guy walked over to me and he said, "Oh my God, man, don't do that. I'll buy it from you." You know, and I said, "What you mean?" He said, "I was working on the line when that bass was built." You know?
My gosh.
And you know, and he said, "Man, man, don't do that to the bass, man." You know, at that point, I just put it back in the case and took it home.
Yeah.
You know, but he said that this bass was one of the first 100 Telecasters built. Now, last night after that thing, I sit up almost for 2 hours, 2-3 hours, looking online, trying to find out when these basses was really built. You know, the Telecaster, because they always they pull out, they show all these precisions, and their precision bass looked exactly like like that Tele bass. You know,
yes,
but,
the early ones, yeah.
Yeah, and but they never said. I never found any clip or anything about the Tele bass. You know, they always just talked about the P bass and how the P bass changed. You know, the whole structure of the electric bass thing. You know,
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm very interested. If you guys know anything about the Tele,
You know,
bass,
we could
man,
probably find that out in Geddy Lee's book, but you know, I would imagine like what Fender did with the jazz bass, they probably tried to appeal to guitar players, right? Because they wanted guitar players to double, and guitar players were familiar with the Telecaster guitar, and essentially the bass has that neck. It's a Telecaster guitar neck, really.
Yeah. But I love that. I love that instrument. It's great.
What, the jazz bass was 61, was it?
The jazz bass was 60, and it was the Fender Deluxe. It came out with the stack knob, and I think the Fender jazz bass as we know it now is a 62 it started. And then, of course, the P bass as we know it now started in 57. And now, George, you started playing bass, what, 1965, 64?
I started playing bass in 65, yeah.
Yeah, 65. Now, at that time, the electric bass was a relatively new instrument. No, it looked like a guitar. Nobody knows what it did. Well, how did you explain that to civilians? What does that instrument do?
Well, that's a good question. I never thought about that answer. I was prepared to tell you that the bass that I played on at that time was a Gibson. Remember, Gibson had that bass that looked sort of like a violin. They had the EBO, right?
Yeah.
That's what it was. And the guy who I used to kind of hang out with, Herbert Wing, he had that bass, and you know, both the bass player in his band and myself would use that bass, you know, whenever, you know, for whenever things. So Herbert was one of those kind of band leaders that had all the equipment. He owned all the equipment. He owned the drums, he owned the piano, he owned the bass, the amps, you know, and he had 2 of those Fender Bassman amps.
Okay.
That you know, that he plugged. It was 2 singers, and he plugged the guitar and 1 amp with a vocal mic, and the bass and the other amp with a second vocal mic, and that was the setup, you know. And so the keyboard player had so it must have been a 3rd amp there, because I know. On the nights when there wasn't a second singer, the keyboard player would plug into that second bassman amp. That's what it was. But we had that was what I learned how to play on. By the time I got to my first bass that I owned, it was a jazz bass.
Okay.
That a friend of mine, at the time I was kind of angry with him, because I thought about it. He wasn't quite a friend. He pawned this bass to me, a jazz bass. It had 3 necks on it. 3 strings on it, and it was painted red. I mean, it was painted a blood red, and you know, and it was you know, it was for $50. He pawned it to me for $50. With the, you know, I'm thinking that, you know, in the early '60s, $50 was a lot of money for a young man.
Sure, yeah.
You know, and trying to come to find out that was my very first bass guitar that I owned was mine. It was mine. Now I paid $50 for it, with, you know, and played on it for a couple of years, not knowing that you know, I could have just went to Worldlines Music and bought that other, because one of the heads, the string bolts was missing.
Okay.
And that just had a big hole up there on the G string. You know, it's just, you know, and I didn't know that you can go and buy that tuning peg. I didn't know that.
Great.
So that was the way it went. And I played on that bass on 3 strings for a few years. I mean, Art Neville told me one time. Art used to tell the story all the time. He said, "Man, I remember when Porter only had 3 strings on his bass. That's when it all went to shit when he bought that other string."